Hi, I'm Hannah Chidlow, and this is for Introduction to Youth Justice 300 at James Madison University. And today I'm going to be discussing empirical evidence criticizing the conditional release of Morgan Geyser, perpetrator of the Slender Man stabbing case. Before I go on, I just want to say that I know a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is contrary to what we've discussed in class, that the juvenile justice system should treat youth offenders different from adult offenders. However, in cases like Morgan Geyser, I believe that sometimes youth can't be rehabilitated and that we need to protect the safety of the public. In 2014, 11 and 12-year-old Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire lured their classmate Peyton Leutner into the woods of a Waukesha park to play hide and seek. Anissa egged her on while Morgan stabbed Peyton 19 times, and she miraculously survived. Morgan and Anissa were arrested as they were walking along Interstate 94. During interrogation, they told investigators that they were heading to Slender Man's mansion. They said that they did it to earn the right to be his servants and feared that he would hurt their families if they didn't follow through. Both the girls were tried as adults in 2017 and used the insanity plea. Anissa received a light sentence and she's already been released. Morgan was sentenced to 40 years to life in a mental institution. The jury accepted that she had been suffering from undiagnosed schizophrenia at the time, and she was additionally diagnosed with autism and PTSD. She disclosed lifelong hallucinations, and she claimed that she was neglected by her family. She was sexually assaulted multiple times by her father, and that her mother had committed incest. In 2024, three independent psychologists petitioned that Morgan had shown considerable progress and she had no symptoms after being weaned off her antipsychotic medication. Now, why are we applying for conditional release of a schizophrenic juvenile homicide offender that's just been taken off their medication? That really doesn't make sense to me. However, a conditional release hearing was scheduled, but then delayed after allegations came up that she'd been possessing graphic novels about black market organ sales, sexual sadism, and murder, and that she had been mailing back and forth with a murder memorabilia collector. She even sent him a disturbing sketch of a decapitated body and a postcard suggesting romantic interest. Nevertheless, she was transferred to a group home in September 2025, where she would be supervised until 2058. It was not a secure facility, and she was allowed to go to public areas if accompanied by an escort. After a short 2 months, she cut off her ankle monitor and fled the group home just a few weeks ago on November 22nd. She was seen on a public security camera at 8 p.m., but it wasn't until 11:30 p.m. that the authorities realized that her ankle monitor had been tampered with and that she was missing, meaning the group home faculty were unaware of her whereabouts for over 3 hours, a severe lack of monitoring for an attempted homicide offender. She was found 24 hours later, 100 miles away, sleeping outside of a truck stop near Chicago, Illinois. She was accompanied by an older man. The fact that Morgan was motivated to run away with a man double her age that she had met one time while accompanied in church is a red flag in and of itself. Initially, the two refused to identify themselves. They gave officers fake names that didn't add up, and she told them that they could just Google her to find out who she is, bragging about the publicity of her crime. I argue that due to the rareness and high severity of this case, that Morgan never should have been released, and that sometimes rehabilitation is not possible for people like Morgan. So how did we get here? First of all, they failed in assessing her risk. Those psychologists were hired by Morgan's legal team, meaning they could have been biased in their verbal testimonies, which were unstructured clinical judgments that have historically evidenced weak and inconsistent predictive validity. Knowing this, decision makers should be extra cautious in extreme cases like Morgan, which is not one that they should let slip through the cracks. Courts often hear, research proves that youth incarceration fails, and that insanity plea equities have low recidivism and moderate revocation rates under conditional release systems. This puts pressure on courts to reduce long-term confinements. Now I'm going to be talking about supporting empirical evidence and first recidivism rates among juvenile homicide offenders that I'm going to be calling JHOs. After the 2012 Supreme Court ruling, Miller v. Alabama banned mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole for juveniles convicted of murder, researchers began studying their recidivism patterns. Out of this sample of JHOs, 60% recidivated after release, 58 of those being a violent offense. There was no difference between the homicide and attempted homicide offenders in relation to likelihood of recidivating. I include this one just to emphasize that patent survival should not matter in Morgan's punishment. This larger sample used a similar method to the previous one and proved nearly identical results. When the follow-up period of the same sample was extended to 30 years, 88% of them had been rearrested, and 63% of them had been arrested for a new violent crime. There were 4 cases of another homicide, and one of them an attempted homicide. Those who had been incarcerated for 6 years or less were significantly more likely to be arrested than those who were incarcerated for longer, meaning long-term confinement was actually helpful here. Again, similar results in this even larger sample. Out of 137 JHOs, the fact that 18 of them committed homicide again, or attempted homicide again, is a fact that we shouldn't ignore. Am I getting my point across yet? And here's just one more sample. Again, very high rates of recidivism. If you want to pause and read it. Now I'm going to be talking about juvenile court versus adult court, or JHOs. Many are saying that the system failed Morgan by placing her into adult court rather than a juvenile court. An evidence review studied whether this difference has an effect of recidivism on violent youth. In this study, juveniles charged as adults did have a higher rearrest rate than those retained in juvenile court, but only by 11%. And similarly, in a Minnesota study. Furthermore, this study specifically validates the placement of those violent juvenile offenders in a penal rather than a rehabilitative system, if you want to read this one. Now I'm going to be talking about age at first offense. The Frontiers in Psychiatry, a 2021 article by them, claimed that among forensic psychiatric patients, a small subset develops a persistent criminal career, often starting early and continuing into adulthood. There's life course persistent offenders that exhibit a high level of aggressive and antisocial behavior with an onset in childhood and persistence into adulthood, a skewed male to female ratio, a higher incidence of neurodevelopmental disorders, and childhood adversities. This means Morgan fits 3 out of 4 of those criteria, and not only that, but she proved by running away that she's willing to break the laws again. Supports the view that mental disorder plus neurodevelopmental disorders plus early conduct problems together may contribute to chronic criminality, and that some patients need long-term secure supervision. The United States Sentencing Commission found that older offenders were less likely than younger offenders to recidivate after release. The limits of this study for my argument is that it's about federal offenders, which Morgan is not. However, I've been trying to argue that Morgan's 8 years in a secure facility was not enough time to even consider her conditional release. This data supports my argument that if her confinement time was longer, therefore she was older than 23, then the likelihood of her reoffending and threatening public safety would be lower. The University of Texas published an extremely relevant study for my case in 2018. Their meta-analytic findings indicate that the strongest predictor of recidivism among high-risk juvenile offenders is the age at which they begin their first offense. The younger the juvenile is at their first offense, the more likely they are to recidivate. This is Moffat's age crime curve. She found that the prevalence of such antisocial behavior substantially increases during early adolescence, peaks in middle to late adolescence, and then declines during early adulthood. Moffat found that at ages 10 and 11, life course persistent individuals represent a relatively high proportion of the population of juveniles who engage in antisocial acts. Ages 12 and 13 account for a small proportion, and ages 14 through 18 account for a very small proportion. Remember that Morgan was 11 during the attempted homicide. Do you see here that 11 is way before the peak? Although yes, she was just a kid, but being that young of a kid is extremely alarming and should have been paid attention to. This is another very similar finding that you can pause to read. It's very similar to the age crime curve. And I just want to conclude that Morgan Geyser is not someone who just made a stupid adolescent mistake. This is someone who is a serious danger to society and whose chances of rehabilitation are low. And the fact that she took the privilege of her transfer to a low security setting as a chance to run away shows a persisting lack of accountability and makes rehabilitation seem even more hopeless for her. And these are my references. Thank you.